Women's Test cricket is something that we don't talk about all that much. And because of that, I feel like we've missed out as a community because women's Test cricket is absolutely and thoroughly wild. It makes no sense at all. And the more I looked into it this week, the more I felt uncomfortable and freaked out and all sorts of things. For instance, when I asked a bunch of experts this week what the process was for women's cricket teams to get Test status and why the teams who have Test status, no one could actually tell me why. So for instance, there are teams that have played women's Test cricket, and yet it doesn't really make a lot of sense how they played it, and then they just never played it again. Are they still actually women's Test teams, or are they just women's Test teams once? No one could answer that question for me. And not only that, no one could tell me how women's Test matches, and I suppose women's Test teams, were actually declared those things. So for instance, I think this one is fairly well known by now, but the Irish men's team actually were not the first Irish team to play Test cricket, because the Irish women did it beforehand. So they actually had Test status all along while the island men were fighting to get Test status, and no one ever talked about it. That is not the weirdest one. I think the weirdest one is the Netherlands team, because the Netherlands men are not a Test playing nation, yet the Netherlands women are a Test playing nation. And I know what you're thinking about, oh Jared, in the olden days, all these things happened. It was 2007. Like, the Dutch men's team had been a thing for a while by then, and they would go on to be a thing over the next 4 or 5 years, and it was almost never mentioned that their women's team had already played a Test match. Now, it is important that they didn't do well. You can see these two numbers here. These are very important. This might look like the amount of runs they made in each innings. That is not what this is. 158 is what they made in that Test match. But this is my favorite part. It took them 163 overs. So the Netherlands women have never won a Test match. They scored 158 in their Test match, and they went at less than a run and over. Truly epic stuff. No one could honour Test cricket more than what the Dutch women did by batting as slowly as physically possible for, let's be honest, 163 overs. That's a long time. They committed to the bit. They are true heroes of women's Test cricket. And as I found out in my research, they are not the only ones. If you love cricket on a deep spiritual level and want to be involved when no matches are being played, we have the game for you. Hit Wicket is so good that Harsha Bogle and me have backed it. And that's a lot of nerd energy behind one game. This is a strategic game of cricket, and it's not just about whacking your screen really hard with your finger. This isn't a game where you swipe all around to try and hit the ball. You work out what works best based on real-life cricket situations. For instance, dot balls bring pressure, ones and twos lead to fours. There is no way you can just hit a six every ball or take wickets all the time. This is proper cricket, yet it still has some special gaming powers in there as well. And so this game is about playing, but also building and managing your team. You are the batter, bowler, owner, coach, captain. It's your dream, right? And there are no ads, it's just cricket. Download Hit Wicket now and bring out the cricket legend in you, because Hit Wicket is a cricket game made for you and supported by other cricket nerds. Stick it in your pocket today. This was made using MV Play's Insights. The same technology that supports the England and New Zealand Test players is available to club cricketers as well. This is mostly about the teams, but there's one story that Hypercourse told me that I just have to tell you about. This is Mabel Bryant. In 1901, she made a double hundred. That's pretty good. And I think it was considered the highest score by a woman at that time. She also took all 10 wickets. She did these two things in the same match. But the real reason I'm talking about Mabel is because she was quite young at that stage. But she would go on to play Test cricket. She would play it until she was 54. But as I said, that was 1901. She would play one Test, and of course, women's cricket took a long time to actually have a Test. So her first Test was in 1937, 36 years after her double hundred and her 10-wicket haul. So when Mabel Bryant played her first Test, she was 54. And when you go through women's cricket, these are the kinds of stories you come up with a lot. As I said, it's a completely wild ride. But what I wanted to do for this video is look at the teams. Let's start with New Zealand. They've become famous recently, partly because I will not stop mentioning it, because they don't play Test matches anymore for the women's side. But when you look up the history of women's Tests, England have played the most, Australia have played the second most, and bing, 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 New Zealand have played the third most. They just suddenly decided sometime in the 2000s that they weren't going to play any Test matches ever again. It's such a bizarre decision to make because New Zealand were the early pioneers in women's cricket, and they had a very good side through that period. They could have played Test cricket. They refused to. But perhaps my most favourite one is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka have played precisely one Test match. They did that in 1998. And generally, if you play one Test match and you never play it again, it's because you didn't do very well. No. They beat Pakistan in that Test match and they thought, we are perfect. We are unbeatable. Let's just keep that record forever. And they have not played a Test match since. Of course, there was a time when the Sri Lankan Cricket Board forgot they had a women's side, so it might be partly because of that. But let's come down here to the West Indies. I found them fascinating when going through all this. So here you have 2 years, right? 1928 and 1976. 1928 is the first men's test for the West Indies, and 1976 is the first women's test. Feels like that is a bit of an oversight, right? That's a long period of time to not have a women's team. But the other interesting thing about that is during the 1980s, when West Indies cricket was absolutely ruling the world, their women did not play matches. They just stopped playing international games altogether. And so the West Indies, with their best team in the world in men's cricket and in women's cricket, did not exist. Worth noting, and part of the inspiration for why we've done this piece is because the FTP has just come out and the West Indian women are playing 3 test matches, which is absolutely awesome. But 2004 was the last time they played a test match. Okay, I think I'm missing one here, and there's a reason that I'm missing them, but let's just put them on the board. Pakistan. Why might I have forgotten Pakistan? Have they played women's test matches? They have played women's test matches, in fact. They haven't won a women's test match. And you might be thinking, well, okay, women's cricket is still in development in Pakistan, Jared. Don't hold that against them. I'm not holding that against them. But I just want to point out that Pakistan have played against Sri Lanka, who've only played in 1 match, and Sri Lanka beat them. Pakistan have also played against Ireland, who have only played in 1 match, and Ireland beat them. I think all things considered, Pakistan have had their chance to win a test, and they are 0-3. I think if I was running Pakistan women's cricket, I'd be making some phone calls to, I don't know, Brazil and Thailand to see if they're interested in playing a game. Or at the very least, Bangladesh. Okay, Bangladesh have not played a women's test match. That seems like an oversight, but their team's getting a lot better at the moment, so surely they will. Afghanistan do not technically have a women's team at the moment, and actually really didn't have a women's team beforehand. They had like a training squad that didn't play. But they are playing a match, which probably won't be an international, or at least an officially international, but it is involving Afghanistan women playing in Australia, so that's a huge step forward. And then we have Zimbabwe. They're really interesting in this whole FTP situation at the moment. And the reason that they're interested in this FTP is because they've been promoted over other teams, including teams like Thailand, who have beaten them to the ODI League. But this FTP in itself is absolutely incredible because of all the test matches teams like the West Indies are playing, because of teams like Zimbabwe playing more matches. Like having a proper women's FTP can really help women's test cricket, but more importantly, all of women's cricket. Because there was a time when women's cricket was weirdly a little bit stronger. For instance, Denmark had played in a Women's World Cup. Not only did Denmark play in a Women's World Cup, they played in a Women's World Cup before Pakistan and before Sri Lanka. Sadly, these days we don't see them anymore, but those matches do have ODI status, which again shows some of the random sides that have status when you look at women's cricket. For instance, what about right on top of Denmark? Let's go to Jamaica. Jamaica has ODI status as well in the women's game because they played in the World Cup. They're not even the only West Indian island to have done this. In fact, there was another team made up for the Women's World Cup as well, which also has status. So in this first Women's World Cup, you had Jamaica in it, and you also had Trinidad and Tobago. But there are 2 other teams that I'm going to have to write in here. How about this one? Young England. That's a fun team to be at a World Cup. And what about the International 11? That's a weird team to be at the World Cup. So Young England had to make up the numbers, and of course they had to put more teams in. So, okay, it's weird, but it's there. International 11. Wonder why they need an International 11 at a World Cup when there are lots of different teams playing. Actually, just forget about the International 11 for a moment, because we'll come back to them. Because one of the other things I found when looking at women's cricket is just how random the grounds are. For instance, there is only one ground that's ever had a lot of tests, and that is Worcester. Which is a little bit odder because these days it doesn't seem to get a lot of women's cricket, but back in the old days it was the epicenter, and it is where women's test matches were often played. So then I started to look through some of the other grounds, and I found some fascinating things. For instance, a couple of years ago, you might remember that Wormsley was used. Do you know what Wormsley is? Does anyone know what this cricket ground is? This is the personal cricket ground of the Getty family. This ground exists because one of the Gettys ended up being friends with Mick Jagger. It's something to do with like rehab and heroin. I can't remember the full story, but either way, he got absolutely obsessed with cricket through Mick Jagger, and he ends up making his own cricket ground, which he makes into like a perfect village cricket ground. But it's so perfect that they do things. The TV show Taskmaster is occasionally recorded there. I know that's a weird fact, but it's true. But more importantly, it's hosted women's test matches. A private venue owned by billionaires has had test matches. But that's just scratching the surface. This ground here is Arden Street. This is in North Melbourne. My family grew up around this ground. My mum used to go and watch footy being played there. Also, when I played underage cricket in under 16s, I played for North Melbourne. I had no idea that this venue ever hosted a test. There was no signs up or anything, and we were certainly never told about it at all. But the other reason I mentioned these two grounds is I've been hit for 6 in both of these grounds. So that's a fun fact. I can add that to the list. This is another one that I know quite well, Bendigo. If you're thinking to yourself, what's Bendigo? It is a small town outside of Melbourne. It has also hosted a women's test match. And when I saw these two, I was thinking to myself, those are so odd. There must be some other odd venues. And I didn't go through all 80 odd of the women's venues, but I did have a bit of a look and see some that stood out, like Collingham Cricket Club. I love it. It doesn't sound like an international venue at all. It just sounds like a place that you play a bad village game on and have a couple of pints afterwards. What about Hale School? I think this one's in Perth. It's a private school in Perth that is hosting a women's test match. This one, and I apologize for the pronunciation on this one, but this is the Jamia Millia Islamia Uni Ground, a university ground, which has hosted a women's test match. Oh, and this one down here is called Cook's Garden. I had to look that up because I thought that was a typo on Cricinfo. But there really is a sports place called Cook's Garden, and it has hosted a women's match. Oh, and of course we're missing a really obvious one here. So let me just write in Lords, because that should go on the board. Wait, sorry, I'm just getting something from my producer. What? Really? Lords has never hosted a women's test match. That seems odd, because they have Eton versus Harrow games. So surely they would have... No, not had a single one. Yeah, okay. Oh, I'll take it off the list, and maybe they should never talk about women's cricket again. Yeah, cool. But we've talked about almost all the teams here except for South Africa, and I really want to get onto South Africa. And you remember we said we were going to talk about the International 11 before. What is an International 11? Why do we need an International 11 at a World Cup? You might be thinking, is it possibly because it was a way of getting South African women into the World Cup? Yes, it is. Rachel Hayhoe Flynn, who was an absolute pioneer for women's cricket, also really liked South Africans and thought that they should be involved in the World Cup. And it didn't quite work out that way, but she came up with an even more genius plan after that, because she was going to have the second Women's World Cup to be played in South Africa during apartheid. Just let that fester for a moment. And you might be thinking, that is crazy. Why would anyone play women's sport in South Africa during apartheid? Well, I've got a bit of a story for you. South Africa started playing women's cricket in 1960-61. So a bit like the West Indies, they had plenty of time to have a women's team, and they didn't do it. I mean, everyone was a bit slow on Test cricket, but the West Indies and South Africa probably more so. So in 1960-61, South Africa played a 4-test series against England. And then after their readmission in the early 1990s, their women had to wait until 2002 to play their first test back. But there was actually a test series in between these two things that I just said. In 1972, New Zealand women's cricket team travelled to South Africa during apartheid and played test cricket. This completely blew my mind, because at that stage in the men's game, South Africa were completely ostracised. And of course, there is a very famous reason for why that happened. Essentially, without going through all the details, and we've done an entire series on this, England ended up with a South African player in their country who wasn't white, who was really good at cricket, Basil D'Oliveira. And he did so well that he ended up on a tour to South Africa. And that's when the South Africans decided that they weren't going to play England anymore, because England were being political by picking a really good cricketer to come and play them. After that, though, Australia was still going to host South Africa. And Don Bradman and Ian Chappell were all for it, but eventually they were talked out of it. So after the Basil D'Oliveira scandal, no one played cricket against South Africa until after apartheid had finished. Except that one New Zealand side who flew over in 1972. That's absolutely crazy to me. That there's almost been no women's test matches ever. They're usually played at random games that you have to Google to even work out. That we have made up teams, that we have countries that we don't even know exist, that we have the West Indies split up, we have all these different things. And yet within that, the New Zealand women's cricket team went and played in apartheid South Africa after almost the entire sporting world had turned their back on them. What happened on that tour? How did this happen? Why isn't there like a documentary series on this? Where are the books? I need to know more about this 3-test series in apartheid South Africa. And as I said at the start, and I'm not taking any of this back, women's test cricket is absolutely unhinged. It is wild. I cannot believe what I am looking at here. I have a book out with Abhishek Mukherjee, and it is called Overthrowing Cricket's Empire. And it's about the stories of how each team beat England for the first time. We go all the way back to the demon Fred Spofforth getting annoyed at W.G. Grace for acting a little bit like Alex Carey. And then we come all the way to present times with Rashid Khan's England's redemption. We cover every single team to beat England in a major international, but we also talk about the incredible stories like the barefoot basher from Fiji that almost played for New Zealand. In fact, this book is full of tales like that, like how Pakistan lost a top batter after he was on the run from an angry husband of a movie star he was having an affair with, and also how one future captain of his nation realised he might have to go out and bat at Lords and that he didn't own his own pads. Cricket was used as a tool by the empire, but what happens when those nations grow up and get good at it? Find Overthrowing Cricket's Empire on Amazon today.